Hey everybody, Joanna here. Today we're going to have a discussion about gendered reading. I already had a video about this topic on my channel several weeks ago, if not months ago, and it generated a lot of discussion in the comment section. And I was pretty clear after I finished the video that there were several points I did not talk about. I didn't talk about the marketing side of things. I didn't talk about the history side of things. And so I wanted to have a deeper discussion about this topic. People in the comment section even recommended that I have a discussion about this topic. So I recruited a couple of my friends here to discuss this. And so I recruited my friend, Jimmy Nuts. Hi, Jimmy.
Hello.
Hello. And I thought Jimmy would be the perfect person to add to this discussion because he not only is my partner when it comes to recommending Dude Bro Lit, as we briefly mentioned in that discussion, as well as chatting with Nuts on his channel, but also Jimmy reads pretty widely, I would say, beyond just epic adult fantasy. He also reads what hot girl fiction and grandma
Yeah.
lit and all these different categories that are not necessarily associated with the typical Dude Bro Lit as well. And then I also wanted to make sure I added to this discussion, first and foremost, of course, the wonderful Bookborn here, because Bookborn did a fantastic discussion on this topic. I think it was a couple of years ago now, on what makes adult fantasy adult, which is going to be very central to what we discuss here today. So thank you so much, Bookborn, for being here as well.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited. Gender discussions are also something I enjoy usually quite a bit.
Yes, I am very much into this topic right now. So I guess I'm just going to go ahead and start off with this general question here. Why talk about gendered reading in fantasy? And as I mentioned in the video that I did several months ago, I felt like it was a topic I hadn't really thought much about before having a channel on BookTube. At the time, I just knew I loved fantasy. I knew I enjoyed reading books that had female protagonists, but I also found myself gravitating to certain types of fantasy that were marketed as adult fantasy over time. And I noticed that I started to notice there was a bit of a gender divide, possibly an audience, in that having a channel that's mostly focused on adult fantasy, there aren't a huge amount of channels that are focused exclusively on adult fantasy that I know of, that I personally know of in my corner of BookTube, that are hosted by women. Bookborn is obviously one of the main channels that comes to mind when it comes to this. And then another reason is looking at the breakdown of my audience, which was at the time, I haven't checked it recently, which was the majority of those viewers happen to be men, which is perfectly fine, but it shows me that the type of books that I talk about seem to gravitate more interest towards male readers than female readers. And I thought that was interesting. I wanted to explore that. And Bookborn, I think you've talked about the same thing as well. And I'm so excited to hear Jimmy's thoughts about this as well. But Bookborn, you said that you found the same breakdown with your channel as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was actually just looking it up to see what it currently is. It's 83% male, which is a pretty significant breakdown, 83 to 16. Yeah, what's really interesting is this is actually a topic I have been interested in long before BookTube, mostly because I have inhabited a lot of male spaces in my life. Math was always my favorite subject. I was an engineering major. My major was 10%, 90% as a breakdown. And my reading habits have always geared similar to yours towards male quote unquote interests, in terms of when I talked to my peers about my reading, it was more often men who had read similarly to me than women. This is a tough combo because you have to deal a lot in stereotypes, and that's not something that always feels really good. And so I always think about, when we talk about trends, we have to be careful that we're not talking about the individual. Trends are useful for many reasons, but we should never use trends to bully or box in an individual. And I think that can be a hard distinction. And then additionally, when we talk about gender and fantasy, there's also this element, well, like, you just wouldn't get it because you're not a woman, or you just wouldn't get it because you're not a man. And where does that intersect with wish fulfillment fantasy, and when wish fulfillment fantasy is okay and when it's harmful or sexist. Those are questions I actually can't easily answer. But I think it's why it makes this topic a little scary. Did I get off topic?
No, that was
No.
absolutely on point, and I completely agree with you. That is the scary part about talking about this topic, is running into those stereotypes and not wanting to box people in, and realize individuals are individuals when it comes to reading and when it comes to preference. And I think that that's also going to be an important topic to bring up as well, about wish fulfillment and sexism and fantasy. Yeah. Yeah. So, do you think, before we get to Jimmy's thoughts on this, do you find that maybe the breakdown and the difference between audiences, like the reason that maybe 83% of your audience happens to be male, do you think that that's has anything or is indicative of the fact that many fantasy fandoms tend to be marketed towards male readers?
I think that's definitely a part of it. Historically, we've seen a lot of instances of it being marketed particularly to men. One example I think of is when The Force Awakens came out. I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was quite the controversy over there not being Rey toys. They focused instead on Finn toys. At the time, the movie wasn't out, and so the toy companies claimed it was to do a red herring so that people thought Finn was the Jedi and not Rey. I took a much more cynical look at that and thought it was because they assumed boys would be playing majorly with Star Wars toys and did not think that boys would want to play with a female character action figure. Now, when you talk about something like that, there's so much that goes into it other than a gut reaction, because maybe it's true. Like, as someone who loves Star Wars, I don't want to be like, Star Wars isn't for girls, which Star Wars is such a basic fandom. I think it's pretty wide appeal at this point. I'd be shocked if it wasn't close to 50-50. But maybe the toy companies do have data that say that. But then is that also a commentary on how we don't think boys can relate to female things, which is a problem in society? I've gotten off track. I'm just saying the topic is complicated. And just because we have a gut reaction doesn't mean things aren't true. But to go back to your point, I'm getting off topic. It's too early. I think also you brought up YA versus adults. And I think we're going to talk about that later. But I do think, like you said, there's very few female-led fantasy channels that don't focus more on YA than adults. And it's interesting. That's a conversation I've looked in a lot. I do think that's a part of it too, and not just marketing, although that's a different marketing tactic.
Absolutely. No, I think everything you said is relevant and valid, and I hope we can go ahead and unpack that even more in this discussion. Jimmy, though, I think you told me that according to YouTube analytics, if you don't mind me asking, do you mind sharing with us your audience breakdown, or do you have a general sense of that?
So for the last year, it's 60-40 female.
Fascinating.
And at one point, it was actually almost up to 70% female, I think, when I was doing reading vlogs. Right now, as of the last 28 days, it is male 57-42. So there's been a big swing.
Wow. What do you think caused such a big swing?
Lack of reading vlogs? I don't know. I don't know. It might also be just the books that are in the thumbnails, right? I was reading a lot of grandma lit last year, in the past year. So maybe that was part of it. But yeah, it's always weird to me because everyone's always like, it's like 80-20 or 90-10. And for the majority of this year, it's been mostly female, which is kind of cool. I mean, I don't know exactly what drives that. It might just be the books that I'm reading, or maybe the way I talk about books, possibly. But it's very different from everyone else I know. I think, especially female creators tend to have male-dominated audiences. So
well, I'm wondering, it's because you're a male creator, if you have more of a female-dominated audience. Is there a lurking variable here?
it might be the jawline. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. That is so interesting. I'm really fascinated by that. Yeah. So I think from here, I do want to get into, as you brought up, Bookborn, YA versus adult. I think this is an important topic to bring up. And I'll just go ahead and start out. This is more anecdotal based on what I've seen over the years, aging myself a bit here. But What I've noticed as a trend, and what I understand actually, even from people like the Library Ladder, who I trust quite a bit to know quite a bit about publishing as well, and I'm sure that you also have some data to back this up as well, is that historically, fantasy as a genre, as we know it, was mostly marketed towards male readers. That was the large real readership, and in fact, I think that's the same thing. The same thing probably goes for science fiction as well, but we're going to mostly be talking about fantasy today. What Something that I know I've spoken with Jenny Wirtz, the author of Wars of Light and Shadow, about this about a little bit, messaging back and forth on Twitter. And something that we talked about is if you looked at the fantasy shelf in the 90s, in the 1990s, or even the 1980s, you would see that it was much smaller than it is today, for one.
Mhm.
There wasn't a YA fantasy section back then. That didn't come until later. And so if you looked at the fantasy shelf at the time, you would see female authors alongside male authors like Anne McCaffrey, Marion Zimmer Bradley, and I'm just pulling out names that I could think of, Mercedes Lackey, uh,
Ursula Le Guin.
Ursula Le Guin. Yes, yes. That's a really good one to bring up too. And yeah, and of course, Jenny Wirtz herself. So several female authors at the time noticed that back then they didn't go by initials, first names. A lot of them were just Mercedes Lackey, for example, Anne McCaffrey. They would go by their regular first name. And then things started to take a shift. Now, a lot of people attribute this to Harry Potter, and sure, I think that Harry Potter did change publishing quite dramatically. And J.K. Rowling, obviously, that's an initialed first name. But I think the larger trend towards creating the market of YA fantasy as we know it might have come a little later with the emergence of Twilight and Hunger Games. I think that those series are what really brought in a huge female focused fandom, and even not just young female readers, but even adult female readers. I remember at the time watching news stories, and there were women who said, "I'm a mom and I love Twilight. I don't care." And so it was bringing in a large female fan base. And as a result, you started to see this huge growing young adult section. There was a young adult section prior to that, just not a big fantasy one. And the fantasy ones just started to explode at that point. So, Bookborn, if you want to add anything to that, does that correspond to your observations or?
Yeah, it corresponds to my research. I wish I had pulled up the numbers, but a few years ago, and I don't even remember what video I did it for, I looked up multiple top lists, top YA fantasy, and then top adult fantasy. And I think top 100, those top 100 lists. And I think in the end, I got like 130 books across like 6 lists for each. And the percentages of authors that were male in adult fantasy and female in YA fantasy were staggering. It was something like 92% of the best YA fantasy books were written by women. That's a made up thing, but it was in like the 90s. It was very high. And male, it was like 75% for adult were male authors.
Okay.
And I just thought, wow, what a divide we have there. And why is that? And I do think Twilight and Harry Potter are big reasonings. Somehow we got separated. It was like, and I don't know how exactly it happened. There's a couple interesting stories. For J.K. Rowling, it was, if I remember correctly, her publisher who suggested she go by J.K. Because they were worried little boys would not want to read a story about a little boy written by a woman. That was the first time I had ever read something of that nature. And since it has become very common for female authors to use initials in adult fantasy, take that or leave that, if that's true or not. What's interesting about Harry Potter is Harry Potter is widely beloved by everybody, but I do find it to have a significant female fandom, even though it is about a boy. Similarly, Hunger Games, I always think it's interesting. They always market that towards women, but I was told about it by many of my male friends. I think it's interesting that, well, anyway, that's besides the point. Yes, I've seen that, and I don't know what it means. I think one thing I always wanted to give up is one of the reasons, I don't know if you experienced this, Joanna. I don't know what your reading journey was like as a child, but as a teen, I struggled getting into adult fantasy because anytime I tried, I would end up getting stories that involved a lot of sexual assault. And that made me very uncomfortable, and I didn't like it. So I stayed in YA much longer, I think, than I would have, actually until I found Wheel of Time, which is pretty clean as far as things go. And I have talked to, again, this is anecdotal, so it's not data, but I've talked to many female friends who have had similar experiences where they read things in adult fantasy that they don't want to, that they're more graphic, especially in assault ways. And I think that's an interesting data. Do I think that's the full story? No. Do I think it describes many women's experiences in adult fantasy? Yes. And I think that's an important part of this gendered conversation, is why women might have gravitated towards YA, which initially was marketed with a much less graphic, much younger audience, so would not necessarily have those thematic elements in the same way. So I don't know. There's a lot.
Yes, absolutely. I can see what you mean. For me, it was a little different. I don't remember coming across a lot of sexual assault when I was younger in fantasy I read. I wasn't the most well-read when it came to fantasy, but I did notice that I felt like I wanted to be seen a little bit more, maybe even in an unconscious way. So when I read The Hobbit, I loved The Hobbit. That was the first fantasy book I ever read. And then I read some of Lord of the Rings. I didn't totally finish it when I was in high school, but I read most of it and I loved it. But I remember getting so excited anytime Galadriel or Arwen were on the page, which wasn't very often, right? Or Eowyn. And I think unconsciously there was part of me that did want to see myself in the books I was reading. So I picked up Elric because my guy friends were the ones who were recommending me a lot of fantasy. I picked up David Eddings, and I just didn't quite see what I was looking for. And then it wasn't until much later in life, actually, when I found out about BookTube. When I first found out about BookTube, I found a lot of YA booktubers, a lot of female YA booktubers that were promoting a lot of young adult fantasy. And I had never really thought about it in terms of young adult. Should I read that or not? I just knew that they were adults reading it. So it was normalized. I think it's been very normalized in our culture. And I think that's part of what happened with the Twilight thing. Like I said, there were mothers who were reading Twilight. There were older women who were reading those books and the Hunger Games. And so I think it became more normalized for women to be reading books that were considered for a young adult category. And before I get called out about this in the comments section, I'll go ahead and clarify, yes, young adult is not a genre. It's an age range. So just to be clear about that. But I found that with the young adult books I was finding, even as an adult, a lot of them having a female protagonist spoke to me as a female reader, as somebody who wanted to be seen in fantasy. And I always say this, and I know I've said this a lot on my channel, but A Song of Ice and Fire was the first series I ever came across where I felt seen as a female reader who wanted big epic worlds, who wanted the complexity of storytelling that part of me was always yearning for. And I got that with Cersei Lannister, with Arya, with Sansa, with this incredible female cast of characters. So I felt like I got that itch scratched for once and I wanted more. So I feel like wanting myself to be seen as a fantasy reader is part of that. And I think that's part of why you'll see in some stats that the majority of people who read young adult literature are actually adults. I think it's because that's where their voices are seen. But then it creates this loop where I suspect some publishers might pressure some female fantasy readers to write towards the YA range and suppress that complexity a bit. I'm not sure. But also, speaking to your point, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dismiss your point. I think you're absolutely right, though, about the graphic sexual violence. I think statistically, we know more women are sexually assaulted than men in our society. And so it makes sense that that would not be pleasant if you've experienced that before as a female reader, or if you've ever felt unsafe in any way as a result of that as a female reader, that maybe that's not what you want to escape into when you're reading a fantasy story. So I always think that's a valid point.
It's also just exhausting because like so much fantasy has it. I mean, it feels like most epic fantasy series I've read have had some form of sexual assault, which, you know, it is part of being human, I guess, at some point, because it does happen. But like, I understand when people are like, yeah, I'm not reading epic fantasy anymore because I'm tired of reading of all this sexual abuse. And it's like, yeah, that makes total sense to me.
I think it's important, real quick, Jimmy, I want to hear your thoughts. I think what I might not have recognized too as a young reader is it was objectification. Like, I think I have words now that I didn't then, because I don't think all sexual assault as a plot point is necessarily bad. In fact, I think it's important, and I think it's done very well in some books. I think sometimes when you were reading from a male gaze, I didn't always know that that was what I didn't like about the situation. And that's a phrase I know now, and can say. So I think that's maybe more what I meant at the time, but I attributed it to the wrong element. But anyway, Jimmy, continue.
No, that was basically it. I was just going to say, like, I understand when people come to me and they're like, this is fatiguing, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not always done well. I mean, that's another thing, is like execution varies across the board. I read a female author that I thought did a very poor job detailing sexual abuse of a young girl this year. That was very, honestly, maybe my least favorite. Not that I would have a favorite, but you know what I'm saying? Like, my least favorite execution of it grossed me out completely, which also, you know, kind of speaks to the fact that, like, I think of whenever Ursula K. Le Guin talks about how she learned how to write like a man, and she wrote like a male because that's all she ever knew, and how much that impacts fantasy, or really books in general. I'm not sure how other people feel about that, like other female authors. I'd love to hear from them about it, but I thought that it was pretty compelling to read about when Le Guin talked about that.
Absolutely. Well, I have a few thoughts about that. So one is a topic that I know, Jimmy, you and I talked about on Chatting with Nuts, about what makes a compelling villain, because it does feel like it's really easy to make somebody evil if they're sexist and if they're racist. If you have a protagonist that relies on those two things, of course you're going to make a detestable character. But that's almost, as you, Bookborn, brought up in your YA video, you brought up that sexual violence can sometimes be a little lazy. It can seem a little lazy depending on the execution. It just depends, I guess, on how they want to, whether they're really deeply exploring that theme or whether they're using it to make the antagonist bad to make the protagonist good. And this leads to another point and another area where I feel like fantasy has historically been a little bit more male dominant. And one of the reasons here is because of the trope of heroic fantasy, or the trope of the hero. If you have the chosen one and the hero, usually, if you look even at comic books, how often are women the hero of the story? More often, at least historically, we have a male hero. That's the typical trope. It's almost a subversion. I know Alan hates when I say that word, but if you have a female hero. Thoughts on that?
Well, I know that comics, I don't want to speak too much to comics because I'm not an expert, but I do know from people that, like, comics have been fairly progressive. I mean, if you look back into them, which is kind of ironic because there's been a big backlash of, like, you know, not in my comics, you know, give me my good old fashioned Spider-Man or whatever. When in reality, you know, that has been, they've always been this way since the beginning of time, and it's just kind of morphed over time. But I can't really speak to that. But yeah, I think heroic fantasy 100% has the idea of, like, the female being kind of second, I guess. I think of the Gardens of the Moon cover that Steven Erikson absolutely hates, which is a random lady with breastplate armor, which makes no sense, and a dude on a horse, and, like, he is above her, right? Like, on the horse, and she's walking. I believe, maybe I'm having a mismemory, but regardless, Erikson hates that cover because, one, the breastplate armor for the female makes zero sense. It's ridiculous.
I have the same.
I don't have the right one. I went and looked.
Yeah,
I have the one which is edited out.
Yes, I have that one too. I have that same one. So it doesn't have the female in it.
Yeah, which, and Erikson, you know, is very opposed to that cover. One, because it's nonsensical, but it's also antithetical to what Malazan set out to be, which was, you know, kind of no patriarchy. There's nothing in there. And almost every single, I shouldn't say almost every single, but a lot of epic fantasy at that point had all been operating underneath the patriarchy. Some question it, push back on it, but a lot of them also did not.
It's definitely Tattersail Erasure, which is, like, a fantastic character.
Yes, Tattersail is the best.
She is.
She's great. And she's also described in a way that is very different than how females were usually described in fantasy books as well. So yeah, I think that there definitely was a trend of that in the heroic fantasy being male dominated and females having a certain look or appearance or role in that. But there's also been really good divergence from that as well,
For
like
sure.
obviously Lazen and many others.
And I can't, I'm not an expert on comics, by the way. I just know, like, from what I think, when I think about comics, I think of Spider-Man and Superman. And I did watch Superman movies when I was younger, Batman, and uh, I know that He-Man's not a comic, but I love She-Ra. I could say that. But it does feel like you were saying, like the male hero has a more dominant position. And then something that came up in a Why Read episode that I had with Fun Fantasy Books, she brought up such an excellent point that because of that, I think because of that trope, maybe she didn't say because of that trope, but she said that often in those type of stories, when we look at, for example, even Lord of the Rings, if we look at Arwen, even if you want to look at the movie version of that, she's the chosen one. Her role as being a chosen one as a female is to be chosen by the male hero, like to
Mhm.
be the chosen love interest of the male hero, and that's psychologically maybe something that's unconscious in our culture. Thoughts about that? I'm
I
just
think
throwing thoughts out. I don't have any data about this, by the
no,
way.
I think what makes these conversations so difficult is, again, the chicken and the egg. We know that historically in our society, men have held more power, which means they had more ability to publish and write the histories and the stories that we read. So, how much is it a sincere difference in interest between male and female readers? And how much of it is historically fantasy was written by men and thus appealed to men because men were writing what appealed to themselves? Um, of course, that's a simplification. Many of my favorite authors are male, and I think write the female experience excellently. And many female authors can write the male experience excellently. Like, obviously, it's not that simple. But if we boil it down, how do we know? It's one of those things like you cannot get data on.
Oh, and
It
I'm not suggesting that the interest of the reader gravitates towards that, but I
oh
am
no,
suggesting that historically we've seen that pattern. So that's
for
like the
sure.
roots of fantasy.
Mhm.
No, I agree with you. That's what I'm saying though, because men wrote fantasy, men would probably write the things they knew or desired or wanted. I don't think that's a bad thing. But how did that shape what we view as fantasy? I don't know if we can ever really know. But it's clear that even from the earliest stories, Beowulf, look, I read Beowulf like 3 different translations. I've got to like bring that up here. The Bible, Greek myths, when we think of our earliest or most lasting stories, we're going to talk about men. Men is the center. Jimmy, you're giving me a look like I said something so wrong.
No, you're spot on. I was just wondering if I should comment any further on the Bible. That was
Um,
my only thing. I
I
was
mean,
just
look,
thinking of the secondary
I'm
vessel verse, which bothers me greatly. But it's probably not the right place to do this. So I'll
probably not.
digress.
I'm sorry I brought it up. But our stories that in society are generally focused on males written by men.
Mhm.
That's how much did that uh influence what we read, and you brought up, I agree that I think Twilight was actually a huge foundation for the YA genre. Um, how much was a woman writing for women the thing that told publishers YA was for women? Like, it may just
Mhm.
be because she was the first to really define it, and the first to define something often becomes the habit, whether it needs to be or not. And Twilight's so interesting because it's come under so much fire. I will admit, I have read Twilight, so I can say that even as a teen, Twilight was tough for me. It was not something that spoke to me in general. There were parts of it I liked, but it didn't speak to me. But the amount of criticism it's gotten is also very interesting. Um, I don't know. I just don't think we can answer the questions, which is why these discussions are so difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, go ahead.
we're talking about like men writing for men, right? And that's something that's like, well, maybe this put a certain image out there, but like I think this is an interesting thing. It's like if a woman said, "I'm going to write a book for women," I think we would all be like, "That's awesome! Like that's great."
Mm.
So can a male write for a male audience? I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But for instance, R. Scott Baker, lot to dig in on R. Scott Baker and his intentions behind what he wrote, and then how it was received based on philosophy that may or may not stand up to the test, whatever. But one of the things he said is like, I wrote this series for males because I want them to feel uncomfortable about what we accept as male gaze and fantasy. That was one of his intentions. And he got destroyed for it, very much online. People still quote it a lot where he said he wrote this book for males. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's inherently a bad thing. And I don't think that's something that shouldn't be done necessarily. Now, the intention behind it is there's very troubling abuse throughout the series. In the sequels, actually, I would say that it's very 50-50. Males' masculinity gets just completely deconstructed in many ways. And it's very uncomfortable to read. He has some very, one of the famous lines from the first trilogy is, she had lived, I think, like, what was it, 40 whorish years or something like that. And it's quoted all the time of like men writing women badly. But his intent is that he wanted to take this male gaze that had been so popular in the fantasy genre, and he wanted to suck in these people, these men who would read it and like read it for that and push it so far that they would become uncomfortable and maybe have a moment of self-reflection. That was kind of his idea. And he had other philosophical things, and I'm not defending any of that here. But the issue is that if some people read it and they go, "This is sick. This is awesome." And it's like, well, so it didn't work for everybody. So is that a failure, and should it not have been done? Now, I think that's maybe a deeper question and more like getting into critiquing him and his work. That's probably not what we're doing here. But like, I don't know. Do you all have a problem with males writing for males or females only writing for females? Like, is that a problem? I have my own belief of it, but I'd like to hear what you two think.
I want to hear Bookborn's answer to this first.
I mean, Jimmy, I totally agree that it should be okay. I think what's difficult is our changing notions of gender. I don't think this question would have been difficult even 20 years ago. I think we have a very evolving sense of gender, and what becomes uncomfortable for people is, what does it mean for men writing for men and women writing for women? And does that mean something inherently about who men are and who women are? And I think that's what makes people uncomfortable. But on a whole, and I've said this in videos, I think boys should have fiction that speaks to young boys and their unique experiences, just as females need fiction. I'm thinking young kids just because, I don't know, that's where my mind goes, needs, that speaks to their unique experiences. What happens is people, I think, take issue is, what does unique mean? Can men and women not have similar experiences? And as our evolving opinion on gender, we become increasingly uncomfortable with making broad stroke generalizations.
Sure.
And that makes these conversations so uncomfortable for people. When at the heart, I agree with you, Jamie. I don't think there's something wrong with it on its surface. I think people worry what it means. Is a book, men writing for men, mean they can be sexist? Is a book, women writing for women?
Yes, that's my opinion.
They can have these wish fulfillment men that upset them, that are perfect and whatever. I don't know. I don't read a lot of like romance, but I know there's problematic tropes in there for men. I've heard.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's my opinion as well. It's like, well, what does that mean, and what's the point of it? I mean, Joanna, you're a great example, though. I mean, you're a reader of dude bro lit, as it's been called, and you are not a dude bro, and I don't think that you're sexist or any of those things. And you happen to enjoy some of the more maybe male dominant pieces of fiction, not just in fantasy, but also obviously Stoner has a critique about how it handles his wife and what that means for the story. And I don't necessarily think those critiques are wrong. I think it's an interesting way of looking at the story, but I think that you're probably a pretty good example of someone who reads things that people would be kind of shocked maybe to hear you talk about. For instance, like R. Scott Baker is just probably the easiest one to talk about. But George R. Martin
brought that up in the original video, right, Joanna? Or am I thinking of another video of yours?
I did. No, I brought up Baker in the original video as well.
Yeah. I mean, he's probably the most polarizing, right? And maybe for some good reasons as well. But George R. Martin's like another great example of this. And he's an imperfect person, an imperfect author. And I think the Daenerys scenes in book 1 are pretty bad. I think they've aged really poorly. The idea that like a female taking charge in the bedroom of like, for all intents and purposes, a very abusive situation, but like her getting on top is like, look how strong it's cringe. It's
Mm.
super cringe. But he also happens to have some of the most amazing female character arcs post that. So like that's a mixed bag, right? Some people read book 1, never read it again. It's like, I totally understand that. But then it's framed as like this anti female series. And that's, and you guys know that like that's just not true.
It's
Uh,
wild.
so I don't know. And here's another thing is like, can a story that's written for males be written by a female? Yes. Can I think of any? I don't know. Maybe Hobb in the Fitz stories, maybe, or a story written for females by a male. Like, how does that work out? I'm not sure.
I almost wonder if that's often the case when, like, for example, like you mentioned, Robin Hobb writing Farseer trilogy, going by the name Robin Hobb for one, but two, having Fitz being the main protagonist. And I don't know if it's just in my imagination. I know there are a lot of women out there who love Robin Hobb, like Derry, for example, and our friend Evie. I know that there are a lot of really strong female Robin Hobb fans. I personally loved Farseer trilogy, but I often find it seems to me like the most of her fandom is male, and I don't know if I'm just imagining that. I could be just imagining that, but I feel like
Yeah,
a lot of men love her male characters.
it's my dad's favorite author. I handed
Really?
him Assassin's Apprentice, and I did not expect at all for him. I mean, I thought he'd like it, but like I wasn't sure. And he was like, Robin Hobb captured what it's like to be a young boy so well. And for him, he's like, he thinks she's the best author of all time now. And this is a guy that read predominantly Stephen King for a very long time as well. It's actually ironic. So my dad is never probably even considered gendered reading or anything of the sort. I mean, he's an older guy. And I handed him Dresden Files, and he was appalled by Harry Dresden. And my dad is not someone who's ever concerned about anybody else's feelings. Like,
Your dad should hang out, Jimmy.
Yes.
I was shocked, but he goes, "Man, Harry Dresden's a bit of a pervert, isn't he?" And I was like, "Oh my God!" Like, this is not someone who's trying to be conscious of any kind of social issues at all. Like, mind you, me and him are pretty much opposite philosophically, I would say. And I was just kind of shocked, and I was like, interesting. Because a lot of people would say like, oh, back in the day, we didn't worry about these things, like no big deal. But, my dad being as close-minded as he can be at times, without me prompting him at all, pointed out two things that I feel are kind of like a strong theme around the discussions about those series, right? Like Dresden, the male gaze, whatever. Also just noir in general has that, like that's a trope in noir. But Hobb also, for me, a lot of people I know that like her say that they feel like she wrote being a young boy very, very well. And you got to be strong, you got to play your role, you got to do these things. And inside you're like, I'm broken and I'm being used as a tool and this sucks. And like, there's no consideration for how Fitz feels in many of the situations, which is horrible. And yeah, I thought it was interesting. Someone who's not in reading circles, does not care at all about social consciousness or any of this. And he had opinions that I probably aligned with, which was weird. So I don't know. I know a lot of people say this is only new age stuff. Everyone's too sensitive, whatever. But like, we're talking about a boomer who is very closed off from social circles and had that opinion. So kind of interesting.
Yeah. I'm personally not of the idea that writers should stay in their lane. Like, don't write outside their own experience. I know some people feel very strongly about this, that people should only write from the experiences that they have had. And I don't personally feel that way, but I also wonder, how can you feel that way if you're into fantasy and you love multi-POV stories? I think that's part of it. I mean, I do think that it's important to have sensitivity readers and to maybe do some research if you're going to explore some different topics or viewpoints. But I'm all for that exploration personally. And I think that's part of why I love reading books that this is my theory. I don't really know for sure, but this is my theory on why I love books like Stoner and Baker is I like to challenge my perspective. I like to go outside my norm. And I guess that's maybe one way to do it. But I also love the female perspective too. And I just want to be clear from the video that I did say that I think it's okay for authors to target certain gendered audiences, whether that be males targeting male audiences, females targeting female audiences, vice versa, or even non-binary audiences, or just having a variety of voices and experiences that they're promoting. Yeah, I think that I'm all for that. But yeah, I just think that that's important to understand that you don't have to read things that I mean, I don't feel the pressure to have to, like, for example, I love R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse series, but it doesn't feel like a problem to me knowing that that was targeted towards male readers. So it's
Mhm.
nuanced, I guess. It
It
is.
also doesn't excuse everything, is
No.
important to say, right?
Oh,
Like
no,
there's
no, no, no. And that's the other topic. That's a really tricky topic for me about the excusing of things because I'm very much at this point in where I stand, I'm very anti, like I don't really promote censorship. I don't think authors necessarily should censor themselves, but I will not promote something that goes against my values and beliefs or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I think we as individuals have the right to say, heck no, I will not read that. I will not promote that. If it has sexism, if it has something that doesn't align with your values, but at the same time, like, I don't know about, I personally don't feel the need to censor, like to promote censorship of books or banning of books, I should
yeah,
say.
at all. Yeah.
No, I don't think most people on BookTube, we're all write what you want, do what you want, let the readers take it.
I mean, it's so counterproductive. It's not even like, it's just,
Yeah. It just means I won't like your book and I might hate on your book.
I mean, that's part of critiquing. I mean, and that's valid. Everyone gets an opinion once the work's out there. And I know there's authorial intent and everything, but it doesn't always matter. Like like if someone comes back to me and is like, R. Scott Baker wrote the most, I might disagree with some of the points, which I do have critiques about it. Like it's not perfect. But I might not agree with them, but they're completely valid in their opinion, and I can argue with them. But at the end of the day, I think everyone gets to kind of share their voice. And I personally like reading from female authors or different walks of life and everything, because for me, I'm just curious about how other people experience reality, because reality is so weird to me. I often just sit around and think about how odd everything is, that like we're all removed from like sensory, right? We're experiencing everything through like our senses, and someone else's senses might be heightened for certain things and diminished in others. And I am not, I know this is surprising, I am not a woman, and I have not experienced life as a woman, but I know that there are plenty of women in my life that I love, and I would like to be able to kind of walk in their shoes a little bit. I think it just makes me a better person, maybe, or at least a more informed person.
Yeah. Did you find, Jimmy, when you read Farseer trilogy, for example, and you found out, right? Did you know before you read Farseer that Robin Hobb was a female writer?
Yeah, I knew that. Actually, it's very strange to me if people are like, Robin is a male name, because my aunt's named Robin. So like, I actually assumed it was a female. And I've also heard that isn't a true statement about Robin Hobb, that she didn't switch her name because of the gender thing, but I don't know if that's true or not.
That she
I
didn't switch it because of that? Oh,
I had heard that was actually like not true, but it's the internet. Who the hell knows? I'm
good to
not sure.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm really curious about that transition because we were talking about historically what's been happening and why there's been this divide. And I know lately there's been the emergence of romantasy that's been coming on the market. And there's been conversation about whether romantasy is fantasy or in romance. I personally am totally fine accepting romantasy as a subgenre of fantasy. I think it's fantasy as fantasy in the title.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting because I also saw a stat that I could put on the screen as well if I remember to do so in editing that showed that YA book sales are actually declining right now. For a long time, YA book sales were the market. There were probably larger book sales for YA than there were for adult fantasy, but that seems to be declining. And I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that might have something to do with the emergence of romantasy, and a lot of romantasy having smut, having a lot of explicit sexual content. making it more adult or marketed towards adults. So there is a bit of a divide that's occurring there, which
What I think
find
is important is, correct me if I'm wrong, because I do not have this data. I should look it up after we're done and maybe make you edit. But
sure.
I think data for the last like decade has said that women hold more of like the book market than men. There are like
Yeah.
women read
Mhm.
more than men. Isn't that just like a
That's-
known
Yeah.
Yes.
fact?
Especially the younger generation. It's dramatic.
Yeah, especially. So what's interesting is romantasy in general, I would say the romantasy I know of is women writers writing for women in general. I'd say the vast majority. So it's interesting if that, what you said, would be like a direct correlation, right? Women who were stuck in YA reading fantasy and YA are now transitioning to adult fantasy that is explicitly stated as written for them by
Mhm.
women. It's a very interesting trend. Obviously, with statistics, we could never prove or disprove, but I think that's a fascinating point.
Could be many things, though. I mean, it could be the fact
so
that
many.
this next generation has seen the negative stigma against YA and it's not taken serious. Maybe that has impacted sales and people feeling like they need to not read that way. Maybe not. It could be
Because
just
of the internet, I think kids are reading stuff much older, like younger are reading things for older audiences more than ever before.
If they're
Yeah.
reading at all.
Well,
Which
I was going to say it could just be straight up a decline in reading. I mean,
Mhm.
the literacy stats for 2022 were depressing. I mean, very depressing. 45 million people can't read above a fifth grade level right now. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I read it was above a third grade level, according to one
costs
report.
$22 billion a year illiteracy does for in America.
Yep, I did a
Yeah.
video about that. Yeah, it's interesting because the whole idea that young adult is a category that is supposed to be marketed towards teenagers, and yet the majority of the audience is adult readers, is strange to me because when I've gone into the YA section, a couple of things. One, I could see that there is maybe a decline in YA sales. I could see that that might be the case because the last few times I've gone to a Barnes and Noble, I've noticed in the YA section, a lot of the books that I've seen on the shelves are books that I've seen there for years. I haven't really seen a whole lot of new titles.
They just shrunk our YA section at our local Barnes and Noble, but you know what it was replaced with? It wasn't romantasy.
Manga.
Boom, got it.
What?
Because our Barnes and Noble had this huge redo. They moved our fantasy and sci-fi sections to, in my opinion, a much smaller spot, and manga took over like 5 shelves.
Yes.
Oh, fascinating. Well, that's really interesting because the second thing I was going to say about the YA bookshelves is that I don't typically see a lot of, I don't ever see books that are marketed towards young male readers, like teenage male readers.
Hatchet.
And
I think that's a children's book.
what is
Hatchet?
Hatchet? I don't know that book.
What?
I don't know it either.
All right, so it's definitely a male book. It's Hatchet by Gary Paulson.
Okay.
Or what about well, what is it? Stay Golden Pony Boy. What is that? Help me.
Oh, The Outsiders?
Thank you.
Oh, that's an old
I was just thinking
classic.
of grabbing that for my son. I loved The Outsiders as a 5th grader.
Oh yeah, it definitely should be. You know what I read as a young male, I guess. I was telling you guys before, I've never really read YA too much. And I actually think that both of those books, I don't know if are considered YA. I don't know if it's middle grade or what
I
it
think
is.
Outsiders is
Outsiders
considered
is
middle
one of the
grade.
first YA books, isn't it? Historically.
Wait, Outsiders? I thought it was middle grade because I read it in elementary school as a part of our curriculum.
Oh, well, maybe it's middle grade then.
I
Well,
don't know.
also, let's
Don't
be
ask me,
honest.
Joanna, you're probably right. You seem to know stats.
I don't. I've looked up this topic a lot over the last year, but
This is all
I don't
fast and
remember.
loose though, right? Like the genre stuff and I'm telling you, like the more I read, the more I am just completely uninterested in genres. I do not care at all what people classify it in the least. I don't.
But again,
I just
YA
don't.
middle grade are not genres. They're
Right.
these categories.
Right. So those are things. But actually, as a young male teen, what things I read and actually helped me out a lot, I thought was Carl Duker, and he wrote a series of probably middle grade. I don't know if they're YA or middle grade, but he wrote like sports dramas for teens, like playing baseball in high school and the star pitcher that you're friends with who is popular, so he's getting into drinking.
What's his
Carl Duker.
Oh, okay.
He writes a lot of books based in Seattle because he grew up there, and he writes about basketball. And he does have like
I need to look this guy up.
I do too.
He's not very popular, but he was popular in my school because I evangelized. I was like, everyone's got to read this guy. And my friends who hate reading to this day, we still talk about Carl Duker. And Heart of a Champion is a book that meant a lot to me because you had this boy, I think he was about a year older than the main character, but the main character was the catcher, and the star of the team was the pitcher, which was his friend. But his friend was about a year older than him and was getting scouted by colleges. So with that popularity, he was able to maybe start drinking a little bit. He was starting to see girls in high school. And spoiler for Heart of a Champion, the kid dies in a car wreck because he was drinking. I believe it's because he was drinking.
Oh,
And the effect that has on our like less popular catcher main character is like it really had this interesting dynamic of a friend getting into a different crowd and then you being left behind. And I had been experiencing that as a young boy of not being ready for a lot of those things that some of my older friends were doing, and I'm feeling disconnected and kind of lost. My friend did not die in a car accident, thankfully, but it really spoke to me, and I think about that book all the time. It's still to this day, and I know it was really impactful for a lot of my friends that read it with me as well. Who were not readers, and well, one of them's a reader now, thankfully. But so yeah, I think that there is stuff out there for boys, but I don't know if it's YA. I don't know. It might be middle grade.
Well, what I was going to say is that the majority of guys that I grew up with, they were all avid readers, but they all read books like Dune and Stephen King novels when they were either in elementary school or middle school.
I read it when I was 11, or I think 10 or 11.
Yeah,
that's so interesting, John, because I think that was my experience too. Boys were reading what we'd classify as adult novels, while girls were reading middle grade and YA. I did think, while you were talking, Jimmy, for some reason, Joanna, did you ever read Garth Nix? If that was a male author who wrote for females, that's who I would choose. I was obsessed with Garth Nix, and I had many female friends obsessed with Garth Nix.
I've heard good things, though.
That's just, again, a story. Maybe he has just as big of a male fandom, but that's fascinating, Jimmy and Joanna, because I think, why is younger literature written for women, or is it because that's where female authors were encouraged to market to that happened?
Well, and I wonder about this too, because statistically, fewer men or fewer males read when they're younger males read than younger females.
Yeah.
And I wonder if part of that is due to the fact that there aren't as many choices for male readers in the YA section as there are for female readers. And then the ones who do turn out to be avid readers, I feel like you're the exception, Jimmy. Like even you and the people that I grew up with, the nerds that I hung out with in high school, the fantasy nerds who were all reading Dune and Stephen King when they were younger, they were all smart kids. They were all smart kids that didn't have a problem picking up adult literature. Whereas I don't know that that's going to be true for every young adult male. Like I'm just not sure. I'm not sure.
I remember attempting to tackle Lord of the Rings when I was 11, and I failed miserably. I think I read those first 3 chapters like 8 times. And, one, I was bored to tears. I'm like, these aren't the movies. But also I struggled with it, like reading it, and just comprehending everything, I guess. But it was also something I came back to later, and I'm glad I did. And I was probably more ready for it when I later on. But I was also late to reading. I didn't start reading until I think the 3rd grade or 4th grade. I was really late. But then like a year later, I was reading at a level that was, I don't know how they test these things, but I was reading at senior level in high school, or freshman in college or something like that. Because once I learned how to read, that's all I wanted to do. Even as a child, I was very unhappy. I don't know why, just who I am. And I just remember wanting to live other lives. And that was like what drove me to reading as a young boy, I would say, where the young boys around me had no issues. It seemed, I mean, I'm sure they did, but like, they just want to do whatever. And I was always like conscious of the fact that I felt like I was like failing to do anything interesting or something. I don't know. So maybe depression pushed me to read as a boy. I don't really know. But there was also always that sense of like low self-esteem in the books I read from Carl Duker. A lot of the main, it's always like a finding yourself type deal, So I don't know if those stories help lost young males better. Or maybe that's what hooks people, or maybe there aren't that many young males that feel that way. I'm not sure.
That is so interesting. Yeah. I don't know. I wish I had more information about this because I know that there's a lot of conversation right now about literacy, the declining levels of literacy, how people are addressing it, how people have been teaching literacy or teaching reading all wrong. But I do wonder about that, especially as we've talked about. Like there are fewer males who read than fewer males that read than women read,
Mhm.
and I can't help but think you're an outlier, Jimmy, in the fact that your literacy levels shot up so high, so rapidly at such a young age. I don't think
You
that's
know, what's interesting about literacy is a lot of people, not you guys, but a lot of people, and I did too, I think, before I started teaching my kids to read, um, misunderstand what literacy means. Um, a lot of people, literacy is just decoding, which means if I give you a sentence, you can read it.
mm,
And what I learned
Mhm.
as I was, or you can verbalize it. Like I give you a sentence, you could say what each word is. And as I was learned as I was teaching both my kids to read, that actually comprehension of what you were reading is like the vital component of literacy. And so when we talk about people reading at a third or fifth grade level, it is not that they cannot decode the words on a page, it's that they have no usable meaning for them.
right.
There's no usable meaning for them to fill out a application form, even if they can read the words,
Yeah.
because they don't have a useful comprehension of what it means. And
Mhm.
so that's the more interesting part. Like as I learned that several years ago now, since I was teaching my son a while ago, um, it totally changed how I viewed reading. Because to your point, Jimmy, someone reads an R. I mean, I haven't read R. Scott Baker, so like this is totally uninformed. But like someone reads that book and completely misses the point. Is that on the author or is that on the reader
Oh,
as
that's the hardest thing. I mean,
as literacy? And that's maybe a more extreme example. I actually, ironically, just this morning I was looking up parent reviews of the Hunger Games. I've read it. My son is really interested, and I wanted to be like sussing out, what do I not remember? Is he old enough? I don't think he is for some of the themes. But some of these parent reviews were shocking in how little they understood the Hunger Games. They were like, it
oh yeah.
glorifies violence. You enjoy the violence too much. Like, this is a book that is promoting violence. And I'm like, you read this book and didn't understand it.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
point blank. You read this and have no concept of the themes. And, and that's a literacy issue, right?
That's far more common, I think, than we realize.
I see it on the internet all the time.
Far more common. I mean,
I
let me
see
tell you, one thing
booktubers.
getting into Song of Ice and Fire fandom.
Mhm.
Oh man. Oh no.
You guys are lovely. I'm just saying some people say things and I'm like, did we read different books? I don't think we read the same. And now that's not to say I'm right. But that is an element to all of this.
It really
That
is.
is
I mean,
people
Dune
think
is a
it's
great
different.
example. I mean, it's a fantastic
Excellent
example.
example.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that's an excellent example. I even think of a book like It. Like, Jimmy, you said that you read that when you were 11 years old?
Yeah, it terrified me. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine reading that, and I mean, I think you were, like I said, an outlier in your level at that age, but I can imagine reading that book when you're at that age and getting the horror elements of it, like, "Ooh, this spooky thing called Pennywise, and these horrible things happening to these kids, following them as adults." But I could also imagine, as somebody who just finished the book, seeing other layers to it that I just can't imagine I would have seen if I had read that at a young
I
age.
was more horrified by the hate crime that happens at the beginning of the book. That's actually what because I didn't finish it as a kid. Actually, it kept me up a couple nights in a row. My dad was like, "Give that book back to the library. Like, I'm not gonna put up with you being up all night." You know, he was so mad. And but it was actually the humans in the book that disturbed me so much because I didn't understand people were that hateful,
Yeah.
which I think ruined a lot of my optimism
I
for
could see that.
humanity. Possibly,
I could
I
see that.
blame I
Mhm.
blame Stephen King for that. Which is interesting because I'm sure a lot of people probably just like glazed by that to get to the Pennywise stuff, but it stuck out to me a lot.
For me, that horrified me more than the Pennywise stuff, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
disturbing.
Yeah, so it's
And I
interesting
don't
to hear
think there's
different
also level where like it's not always bad. I think if you read a book as a kid and don't fully you understand it on this level and then you read it as an adult and understand it on another level, that's also not bad.
No.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. I feel that way even with songs, like songs I loved when I was a teenager, and then I'll re-listen to them as adult, and I'll get another layer of subtext or context to what the writer was saying, and it just blows my mind. I love that. I think that's actually a positive thing. So I don't think we
Mhm.
should I would be in favor of still encouraging people to read that kind of literature at a young age, even if they don't get everything. I think that's true for all of us, even with classics, for example. Some of us might read a classic book of literature, and I know me at my even at my level, I probably wouldn't get everything out of every classic, but there could be room to reread or to learn more, and I think that's part of
I mean,
literacy.
and there's always the joke, like there's that classic joke about when you watch Disney movies as a kid and then as an adult you start identifying with the parents in the story. Like it's the famous
Mm.
example is Ariel. Like, yeah, you are a child. Like I'm on King Triton's side. I think there's an element to that in the books we read as well. Like you may identify with a young protagonist and you read that book
Mhm.
later in life and might find yourself relating much more to the adults in the story. I think that generally
Yeah.
happens with very skilled writers who can write different ages authentically. But again, that's not bad. So it's this is why these conversations are so difficult.
They are difficult, but they're interesting too. I really liked your video that you made about what makes adult fantasy adult. And one of the things that you talked about was prose, the complexity of prose. And again, that could go into reading comprehension to some degree, or even just the decoding part of reading comprehension, just the very basic level. And I find it interesting because a lot of times when in our sphere of book culture, if somebody says, "Oh, this book was YA," they say it as a negative thing, as a derogatory thing. And
Yeah.
I find that maybe the reason they do that is because they found they're saying that that's code for the themes were very straightforward, the writing style was very basic, there wasn't a lot of complexity. And I don't know. I know some people really hate when people use the term YA in that way, but I can understand too feeling that way about a book at the same time. Maybe that's not the best way to explain it. But I also feel like there's a flip side to this. Whereas in adult fantasy, even in adult fantasy, if you have prose that goes any that's not what is it, Sanderson's term, window glass plane
Window
type
pane.
prose,
Window
window
pane.
pane prose. If it's not super clear cut, then people say it's flowery, and they say that is a derogatory term. Like they get angry if the prose isn't very succinct and straightforward. So I feel like people can't win in some ways.
Yeah, and then it just all becomes like, if depends on people's criteria for being YA, right? Like that's one of the hardest things because you could say if kids are predominantly featured, maybe it should be YA. Well, then is A Song of Ice and Fire YA? I don't know. Bran Stark
No.
is of
So
course not. Of course not. Right. Of course not.
one thing that's interesting, I did a video several years ago about what the next big thing in fantasy is. And I
Mm,
said one of the key elements I noticed of stories that stand the test of time and receive like wide acceptance or acclaim or like uh, insertion in our pop culture are usually novels that work for children and adults. They are acceptable for children, but have deep enough themes to interest adults. Lord of the Rings is a great example of this. Lord of the Rings, there's no reason a child couldn't read it other than like the 1950s language is a little bit of a hurdle today, but
Mm.
many children read that and they can. I'm like Jimmy. Jimmy, I didn't read that book till I was an adult. I don't think I could have read that as a kid. I wouldn't have been ready for it.
Yeah.
Are you disagreeing? Do you like hate Lord of the Rings or something?
No, 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 no. Continue. I will. I have a rebuttal.
Okay, great. I want a rebuttal. And I this isn't like a really wildly known, but I was thinking of The Giver recently. Have you guys read The Giver?
I've never read The Giver.
Oh my
Everyone else
gosh.
has.
I
I
haven't
know.
either.
Okay. Well, I gave that to my son recently. He loved it. I reread it as an adult and got very different things out of it. And I was like, wow, this is a children's book that is very deep. But it works on multiple levels. Star Wars isn't a book, but Star Wars is kind of the same thing. It appeals to children, it appeals to adults. The rebuttal I think you're going to say, Jimmy, is maybe that's because the general populace is very uneducated and we're not smart enough, which is maybe true. But I do think there's an element that like stories can work for multiple generations if someone is skilled enough to put the layers there. And so I don't, my point being, Joanna, is that I agree that just because something is a children's book or a YA book shouldn't automatically be this age range that is derided. Because just because something is clean enough and and able to be worked with for a child does not mean there is not something of value or could never be something of value
Yeah.
for other readers. And I do think that is something that can be frustrating, that like something has to be gritty or whatever to have themes for adults. I just reject that has to be true, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about that could be a difference, because I know there's a lot of conversation about the difference between YA category and adult category. Several of the ones you mentioned, I'll just briefly go through: adult characters versus young, kid characters, or even if it is a kid character in an adult story, often it's framed in such a way where it's the adult telling his story, like Fitz is older telling his story as a young kid. That's often the case, not always the case. Not there, of course, are exceptions to all of these. Advanced prose, meaning that we have more complex sentence structures, or maybe there's more deeper levels of reading comprehension that might be required to some degree. And like we said, there's a range when it comes to that. And then the scope or number of characters, the complex ideas that are being portrayed. And I think that, but something else that comes to mind, and there are several other categories that come to mind with this, but something else that comes to mind when it comes to young adult versus adult, and this is just based on my experience, is also the ending of a story. I find I personally love stories that end a little bit open-ended and that end with a little bit of some bittersweet tones, maybe a sense of melancholy that maybe is not wrapped up in a perfect bow ending. I always say this about the romance genre. Every romance book I've read so far has ended with a neat little bow ending. Like every end is neatly tied up. And that's
Supposedly that's a thing of the genre. Supposedly
Yeah.
if it doesn't, it can't be considered romance. That's what someone told me.
Oh, really?
That's
Oh,
great.
Yeah, because like I was looking into it when I had to read a romance for SPFBO, and people were like, no, if it ends tragically or not definitively, it cannot be considered a romance.
It is such a romance. It's such a hallmark of a romance novel, isn't it? Now, I loved Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which I know is a little bit satirical, but it does end very neatly. So I do think that's a hallmark of the genre. Whereas with adult books, you can have that tragic ending. You can have that open ending. I don't really, I don't find that often the case with young adult literature. Not often. I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions out there I'm not thinking of, but I think usually you have a happy ending in most young adult literature. So that's something else that just came up in my thoughts.
I mean, Hunger Games, The Giver,
I
don't
haven't
have necessarily neat tied up endings. You haven't read The Giver. Oh my gosh, you
I've
guys
never
should just
read
read
The
The Giver.
Giver.
Like, it'll take you like 2 hours
Okay.
and you could just read it. It's tiny.
I haven't
You're
read.
right. I truly agree with you though, Joanna. I brought up 2 like examples, but I think
Oh
you're
no,
correct.
that's good. I'm glad to know that. I've only read the first book in the Hunger Games. I've only read the first Hunger
Oh, the
Games.
third book I would not consider a neat bow. I mean,
That's good to
actually, in
know.
some ways it is tied up with a bow, but it's not a good bow. I think it's like sad, but it's not open-ended. So I guess that's a good point, Joanna. Like, even though I would say that is a much darker book, it is still very tied up. There's loose ends that are all completed. So I think your point stands.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Those are just some general thoughts. Not to say, of course, there can't be adult literature that does the neat ending, but it's just a trend I've noticed.
What were you going to rebuttal, Jimmy? We kind of moved past your rebuttal.
Oh, when you said like what's going to be the next big thing in fantasy, the answer is actually whatever gets adapted. That's actually the answer, right?
That was one of my qualifications, if that helps, Jimmy. But what
I don't think you're wrong, by the way, at all. But for instance, A Song of Ice and Fire would not be considered children. It's the biggest television show of all time. So that I think that you're mostly right, but I think having an adaptation because people just are not willing to read as much.
A Song of Ice and Fire actually I brought up in that video. Now I brought it up before I'd ever read it. But I talked about how it's a step under Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter in fame.
Yeah,
very small step, but it is a step under in fame.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Yeah.
And I
agree.
said I wondered for two reasons. One, is it because, and I know, Jimmy, you like season 8. Again, I have no skin in this game.
Whoa. I like parts of season 8. Well,
There are good parts of season 8.
Yeah.
I am not trying to bring this discussion. I know nothing. Again, I am Jon Snow. I know nothing. I think the reaction to season 8 may have harmed its legacy.
Yeah, the legacy
general.
of it.
For sure.
Yeah.
The unfinished nature of the series may have harmed the legacy in ways that Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings do not suffer from.
Yeah, I'd agree with
Or
that.
it could be the adult nature. I said the problem is those are all so interacted. You can't really separate them from each other.
Yeah, it's all three. The only thing I will say is actually, as far as like the bad ending, it is not reflected in the amount of people still watching the show. It's actually almost always in the top 10 to 20 stream shows every year since it's ended, which is incredible. We really haven't seen that for anything other than like The Office, because people can't seem to let it go. But that is so like that's a weird one. But I think the legacy piece of it, yeah, I would say you're probably correct. I mean, also, we have a tendency of like exaggerating things on the internet. Like the internet is just always down for the most hottest, red hot take of all time. And I remember people saying that it was completely culturally irrelevant and it was dead. No one ever cared again. And then House of Dragon like set a max record for view. So it's like, people say one thing and then they're still watching. So it's hard.
People in it have a hard time understanding legacy. I was a good litmus test, because when I read that book, I was like, I had no idea that was from like A Song of Ice and Fire. Like there were phrases that were so, ingrained, referenced so often, and I hadn't realized that was their original reference point. I do think it has, pop culturally gone in. This wasn't.
But you're right. But you are right. I mean, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter are a step above in popularity.
I think because the children factor, you can.
Yeah.
When you can market to children and parents can share things with children and have money to buy things for children. Obviously, I would love my son to read A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm not giving that to him for quite a bit of time.
Yeah.
So I do think that is an element. But anyway.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's the biggest element, most likely.
Yeah. I think Dune had great success, the movies, bringing the book back into the focus. Even my young nephew wanted to read the book after watching the movie. Of course, he probably didn't understand a lot of the politics and a lot of some of the central themes, but it got his excitement up. And I think probably because he was such a Star Wars fan, I think it was like the perfect, it was just the perfect bridge from that. So influence from that, I should say.
Yeah.
Although Dune came first, of course. So something that I found really interesting as far as what we were talking about historically, we noticed that there was this split where more women were being promoted in the young adult space in fantasy than the adult space. And I feel like we're starting to see that circle back around. And this is where I found a video that you did in the not too distant past, really interesting Bookborn, where you talked about authors and social media presence. And I feel like because we're seeing more authors is being expected by their publishers to have a social media presence, to be up front and center, to show their faces, I do wonder if that trend of adult female authors who go by an initial name, if that's going to be a thing of the past in the future and moving forward, whether we need less of that, whether people could just be out there with their name and who they are, gender-wise, or whatever they identify as. If that's going to matter less in the future, which I think is great. I think it's good if people don't have to hide who they are or what they identify as. I think that more diversity in the genre is a good thing. And so it's a trend I'd like to see happen. I could see the rationale behind having the initial names for a time, but it is my hope that we get past those biases and that we just see more diversity in general.
I mean, also, I think just having an initials is like outside of the use of kind of obscuring yourself. I think it's also just almost a cliche for an author to do so, right? Like George,
because there are male authors who do it.
George
too.
Railroad Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Like, so I don't necessarily think that it's always that. Like, I think some people like the idea of a pen name and having that, because whenever I've thought of pen names, I've always had initials in them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just because I felt like I was supposed to or something. I don't know.
It can also be now for SEO. I've heard some people take pen names because their names
Oh.
were too common. It
Yeah,
was too difficult to Google.
that makes a lot of sense, actually.
That
Yeah.
does make a lot of sense. Yeah. I know that you brought that up to Bookborn in your video about I'm sorry, I was just, like, going through a line of your videos.
I'm so honored, Joanna.
I've clearly done my research on your videos. But you were talking about self-published books and your tips to self-published authors and to make sure that their book titles aren't the same as other famous book titles. But I could see that also being a challenge if you have a common name and you're an author. Maybe you do wanna have a pen name, something different.
I mean, think about Daniel Green. Like, that was unfortunate. I think he's Daniel B. Green as an author, isn't he? Doesn't he put the B in there?
Is there another Daniel Green out there?
Oh, there has to be
Very
some.
famously. Isn't he the guy who wrote Fault in Our Stars?
I thought that was. I don't think
Hank.
it's Daniel Green. I think
Is
it's
Is it a different Green?
How
hold
funny.
on.
There was
Oh.
famously like another Daniel Green out there.
John Green. It's John.
Oh, that
Green.
was John Green. Maybe that was my problem.
But Daniel Green is a very generic name. Very
Daniel Green is also a
basic.
very generic name. But there's also
Sorry,
Hank
Daniel.
Green and John Green is who I was thinking of, are also very famous last names. So if you put Green author, they would for sure be the ones who came up. I mean, he's doing just fine. He's got a big audience. But I'm just saying, like, that can be a hard thing if your name is John Smith. You might need a pen name. I mean, I agree, though. I think you would hope that as time goes on, we care less about the author and more about the work.
Right.
Who cares if you identify with a work that is written by someone very different than you? Maybe that's a positive. It is a positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's a thing too. Like I could see the value in like we were talking about. If you go into a bookstore, if somebody goes into a bookstore and maybe they're even unconsciously put off by, oh, that's by a female author, and I want to read a male targeted book or whatever. I still think representation matters. I guess I just come at this from I'm okay with initial names, by the way. I have nothing against initial names, but I'm just thinking about the social media presence thing and how that's becoming more of a thing. I think that representation matters. I think about this like in the music sphere, that's changed a lot. If you looked up, for example, if you did a Google Images search, I would say even a decade ago, if you did a Google Images search on saxophone player or percussionist, the majority of images that you would see would be a white male percussionist or a white male saxophone player. Or if you Googled a flute player or a singer, you would more often than not see a female playing those instruments or singing. And now I think if you do a Google search, you see a lot more variety and diversity when it comes to that. So I feel like that makes a difference, especially for young people when they see, oh, I could be in these different roles. That's normal. That's not abnormal because those images get into our unconscious mind. So people might have these biases and not even realize it. And so I do feel like it matters to see those different voices, to see that diversity represented is all I wanted to say about that.
Two things to your point that actually brings it back to gender. First, we definitely know those biases exist because Google AI was learning on them. Did you guys hear about that?
No.
Like the translations, Google Translate was translating the doctor to like a male, because some languages have male and female forms, right?
Yes.
Like
La. Yeah.
English doesn't la or l, and based on how most often the English phrase was used, it was translating to male or female based on it. So the doctor would always be male, for example, because of the way AI learns. So it talked about how, wow, we're teaching that. Anyway, so yes, the stereotypes exist. But bringing it back to gendered, you bring up a great point. Representation is important. On some level, seeing ourselves is important, which means that boys seeing themselves represented in fiction is still important. I think sometimes we have a tendency to swing the pendulum too far. To Jimmy's point, yeah, like I think men writing a book for men is not on its surface bad. What can be bad is what that means. What we're saying about society when we do that. Similarly for anything else. But I think at some point, as much we have to recognize that there are trends and perhaps there are things that are unique to a female versus male growing up experience, for example, just as there are unique experiences to me as a white person growing up versus someone of a minority race growing up, that we have had different experiences very
Mhm.
clearly and how they would want their experiences represented in fiction.
It also just
Um,
comes down to what sells. That's what it all comes down to.
and it
Yeah, we
all
can't
comes
ignore
down.
that.
I mean, that's at the root of all of it.
It is at the root of all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the tricky part. I mean, I know at the end of the day, publishers are going to market what sells, and they're going to market it in a certain way according to that.
Although
So,
publishing is slow. That's the one thing I think
Mhm.
that self-publishing, why it has risen, is because self-publishing responds quicker to what
hmm,
Mm.
sells. But I do agree.
interesting. It's something I've thought about a lot, though, especially because I've thought about this topic a lot in terms of music. And I've brought this up before, but um, this might not be something that affects us, though, if we read widely. That's I guess the thing, and I guess that's just up to individuals as well, whether you read widely in terms of reading from various voices, various types of literature. I think that can make a big difference. When it comes to music, though, how I got really interested in the topic of gender was in this chapter that I read in a sociology book, and, it goes into gender identity and music, and, of course, distinguishing the difference between biological sex and gender identity, which is important to understand, but one of the things that the author said is that there are certain ways in which we can have these implicit biases when it comes to gender, and specifically, like, when it comes to music, and I think this could possibly transfer to literature, I'm not sure. They were bringing up this example. It says here that when listeners are aware that the composer is a woman, so a composer being a writer of the music, a long history shows that they tend to perceive the inherent meanings of the music in terms of delineated femininity. Sorry, I can't say that word very well. For example, a Scandinavian music critic was in the habit of writing rave reviews about a particular composer. After many reviews, the critic found out that the composer was a woman. He carried on writing good reviews, but his language changed. He ceased to describe the music with words like strident and virile and powerful, and began to include words like delicate and sensitive.
Hmm.
What had happened was that his new knowledge that the composer was a woman, or in terms I am suggesting, the delineation of the femininity of the composer, affected the way he also heard the inherent meanings. So, in other words, the music didn't change. The composer continued to write the music like she was writing it, but the critic's ear, the way they heard the music, changed. And of course, we don't know for sure if that was conscious or unconscious, but the author here seems to suspect this was unconscious on the critic's part, that the way they heard the music changed once they found out the composer was female. Before, when they assumed it was a male composer, they're like, this is powerful, this is strident. And then when they found out, oh, it's a female composer, oh, this is a very delicate piece. It's very sensitive. Like the
Mhm.
verbiage changed. So it's always made me wonder if that affects female authors, especially in the adult space or even in the young adult space, like if that's affecting
I
readers
think it
in an unconscious level.
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I guess that's all justification in a way for authors who wanted to be a little bit more anonymous with how they present themselves on their, whether it's through initial names or just keep themselves a little more anonymous. But at the same time, like I said, I am curious about this changing landscape, and I hope that we as readers can become conscious of that. And because I don't think that's just necessarily, by the way, a male making that unconscious choice. I think that could have easily happened if it were a female critic and then making the same assumptions or the same inferences. So I just want to be clear about that too.
Mhm.
the opposite way too. Perhaps if I'm reading an assault scene from a female writer, I'm going to give her more benefit of the doubt while I'm reading than
Oh,
I would a male author. It could
yeah.
go both ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, it's really interesting too because there are a lot of female writers that write a lot of explicit violence. For example, Mercedes Lackey's Eros trilogy, which I read last year, apparently that was originally marketed towards middle grade readers. That's what Bridger from the Library Ladder told me. There is some explicit violence in that trilogy towards the end. But there could be a tendency, like you said, to be more forgiving, like, oh, well, it's a female author.
She knows
Yeah,
what she's doing.
yeah, exactly. So I don't know. Yeah, it's just something that came to mind that I wanted to bring
We
up.
all have biases,
We all
and
do.
they're not always easily discernible.
No,
Mhm.
we all have biases. Yes, absolutely. And we could even have biases towards our own group. So it's important to
Mhm.
know that. All right. Well, any closing thoughts on the topic?
I have
You go
none.
first.
I have none either, except that I just really enjoyed talking to you two about this topic because it is complex. There are a lot of layers
Mhm.
to it. And I do appreciate that both of you brought up that fact that there aren't easy answers when it comes to these things. I didn't really expect to come to a conclusive point about these things or a conclusive takeaway, just kind of presenting the various complex parts of this puzzle when it comes to gendered reading and how it's evolving and maybe how my thoughts are evolving because I always feel like my thoughts on these topics are always evolving. So
I probably said something stupid, so I apologize.
I
Me
probably said
too.
something
I'm
stupid.
with Jimmy.
Well, thank you both for joining me today. And thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.